Welcome to Venezuela, the kind of country you dream about. In Venezuela, every day is the perfect day. Each year, thousands of tourists visit the country to enjoy the wonderful beaches and the glorious sun. Venezuela's real wealth lies beneath the ground. It boasts the largest reserves of oil in the world. Such wealth has been causing wonderful economic growth over recent years. With such blessings from God, surely the future of Venezuela can be nothing but wealth and prosperity. Wealth and prosperity. Wealth and prosperity.
The streets of Venezuela's capital, Caracas, have turned into a battleground.
The renewed wave of protests has drawn hundreds of thousands of people across Venezuela. They insist they'll continue protesting until the Venezuelan leader gives up his hold on power.
The dynamic has changed. It now feels very hostile.
Ahora, Señor, tú te hagas presente en este pueblo, Señor. Queremos, Señor. Aquí estamos delante de tu presencia, Padre Santo. Queremos, Señor. Aquí estamos delante de tu presencia.
In 2002, a mere 20 years ago, Venezuela was the richest country in South America. Blessed with more oil reserves than any other nation, it looked like the future was bright. Today, that promising country is gone, now one of Latin America's poorest nations with widespread hunger and desperation. In 2017, the average Venezuelan lost 11 kilograms due to lack of food. The situation is so bleak that 6 million have fled, many walking for days to reach neighboring countries. As well as economic ruin, Venezuela has also lost its democracy. From a nation with respectable elections to now a totalitarian police state. So how did this happen? How did Venezuela go from being the envy of other Latin American nations to their greatest source of refugees? How did it go from a country with frequent transfers of power to one that's tried everything but still can't get rid of its dictator? In short, how did Venezuela become Latin America's greatest disaster of recent history? In the 1950s, Venezuela was the fourth richest country on the planet, and over the next few decades enjoyed something of a golden period. There seemed to be political stability and fast economic growth. However, under the surface, things weren't so rosy. Venezuela's enormous oil reserves led to a dependence on this one export. The country's fortunes would fluctuate with the price of oil. In 1973, war in the Middle East led to the oil price quadrupling in 1 year. For Venezuela, this was a bonanza. The government nationalized the oil companies and its income soared. However, while the government's income increased, its spending increased even more. The government spent and wasted so much money that by the end of the 1970s it was deeply in debt. When a new president took power in 1979, he quipped that he was taking power of a mortgaged Venezuela. Things might have been okay had the oil price remained high, but in the 1980s it crashed. What had been a feast became famine, and the country entered into a deep recession. It was around this time that a young Marxist named Hugo Chavez began planning a military coup. Chavez was in the army and had grown cynical of Venezuelan politics. With the economy in crisis, he decided that he would take power and use Venezuela's oil money to build a communist utopia. Throughout the 1980s, Chavez recruited men to his cause, and soon he had his own private army. Meanwhile, discontent was rising in the population. The government tried to introduce measures to improve the economy, but they were deeply unpopular. In 1989, there was a wave of riots and looting that became known as the Caracazo. It lasted for 9 days and hundreds of people were killed by the security services. For Hugo Chavez, who was continuing to recruit soldiers, this discontent played right into his hands. At this point, he was still largely unknown to the Venezuelan public, but that changed in 1992 when he attempted the coup that he'd been planning for so long. The coup failed, but Chavez was not going to give up. When he addressed his soldiers, he told them to lay down their weapons, but made clear that they would try again.
Por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados en la ciudad capital. Hicieron muy bien por allá, pero ya es tiempo de evitar más derramamiento de sangre.
Chavez was imprisoned for a year. However, to many in the population, he was a hero. To the common people, Chavez was more relatable than the ruling elites that they hated. Like them, he had dark skin and spoke the way they did. The corruption of the political class was highlighted the next year when the president was impeached for embezzlement. Chavez came to be seen as the brave soldier who had taken a stand against the corrupt ruling class. He was released a year later and dedicated himself to winning power through the ballot box. He campaigned all over the country, and by the time of the 1998 election, Chavez was the most popular man in Venezuela. His popularity, combined with the hatred of the ruling elite, resulted in him winning 56% of the vote, an unambiguous victory. The election of Chavez received the blessing of left-wingers all over the world.
And what's so exciting about at last visiting Venezuela, I can see how a better world is being created and can speak to the person who's inspired it.
Chavez was a total outsider. Nobody knew what to expect from him. Just how radical would he be? As soon as he came to power, Chavez wasted no time in changing Venezuela's constitution. At that point, Venezuelan presidents were limited to only one term in office, but Chavez didn't want just one term. He called a referendum on whether to change the constitution and won. There was then an election to determine who would write the new constitution, and again Chavez won. The new constitution came into effect in 1999. This, importantly, meant that Chavez would be able to run for a second term. Also significantly, it decreased the power of Congress, which was good for Chavez since he didn't control Congress. With almost total power, Chavez began the policy that would be one of the most damaging to the Venezuelan economy. That policy was expropriation, also called nationalization. Essentially, it meant that the government confiscated businesses or land from private citizens. The first examples were the expropriation of farmland. Chavez wanted land to be taken from the rich and given to the poor. He gave low-level officials the power to seize land that they deemed not productive enough. The official could then give the land to somebody else. Of course, this was wide open for abuse, and officials would just confiscate land and give it to their friends or political supporters. People who had spent years investing in their farms would have everything taken from them.
Aquí es una finca a la cual le dediqué 28 años de mi vida, donde invertí todos mis recursos. Y que bueno, después de la ocupación de la finca, aunque aparentemente estoy expropiado, a mí nunca me han dicho que me han quitado la finca, no me han pagado mis terrenos.
Often, the expropriations were essentially just government-sanctioned looting.
Empezaron en ese momento a tomar posesión de los tractores y empezaron a saquear prácticamente toda la finca. Y pues en ese momento yo estoy recibiendo llamadas de los mismos trabajadores, mira, que me están quitando el tractor, que se están metiendo en la bomba.
The opposition were against these measures and were now determined to oust Chavez. There were many powerful groups against him. Business, labor unions, the church, the media, even parts of the military. Over the next few years, they would make 3 big attempts to remove Chavez from power. The first was a coup attempt on April 12, 2002. At 3 a.m., Chavez was arrested by the military and taken to a nearby island. The public was told that he resigned. In his place was put a conservative business leader. However, the coup quickly fell apart. The new president filled his cabinet with conservatives, cutting out the labor unions that had been involved in making the coup happen. These groups were, of course, outraged. He then dissolved all the institutions and even tore up the constitution.
Cargo a los diputados principales y suplentes a la Asamblea Nacional.
Chavez supporters took to the streets in protest, and 50 people were killed over 4 days. Members of the military that were loyal to Chavez retook the presidential palace, and the new government had to flee. Chavez was rescued in a helicopter and returned to power. The coup had failed, mainly due to incompetence. In 2003, the opposition tried again to remove Chavez, this time in a general strike that lasted 2 months. Huge numbers of people refused to work and the economy was brought to a standstill. There were frequent protests in the Caracas Plaza, sometimes involving shootings. All sorts of different groups joined the protests, even Supreme Court judges and tax collectors. Eventually, the strikers gave in and returned to work, and for a second time Chavez had beaten the opposition. Since the oil industry was so important in Venezuela, Chavez wanted to get control of the state oil company, PDVSA. It had been owned by the government for decades, however the people that ran it were against Chavez. He sacked more than 18,000 employees, almost half the workforce. He then filled those vacancies with his supporters that he could control. Chavez now had direct control over all the oil money, which he used to pay for welfare programs for the poor. He also used it to buy votes and to pay bribes. In 2004, the opposition tried again to remove Chavez, this time in a recall referendum. The constitution that he had implemented in 1999 had a facility where the president could be removed in a referendum. In order for the referendum to happen, 20% of the electorate needed to sign a petition saying that they wanted it. The petition easily got to 20%, and the referendum went ahead in August of 2004. Chavez denounced the whole thing as a fraud. In the end, he had nothing to worry about, as he won the referendum 60-40. With the win in the referendum, Chavez became increasingly anti-American. He believed that the USA had made the referendum happen because they wanted him gone. He made all sorts of insults towards the USA and President Bush.
De papá lo fueron llevando. Fue un alcohólico. Ustedes tienen de presidente un alcohólico, es la verdad. You are a donkey, Mr. Danger.
As relations with the USA soured, Chavez aligned more and more with China and Russia, who went on to lend huge amounts of money to Venezuela. Chavez continued to subjugate the country's institutions. In 2004, he packed the Supreme Court, adding 12 new justices that he could control. He then went after the media. They'd been against him since he took power. They'd backed the coup attempt in 2002 and the general strike of 2003. Chavez alleged that there was a media conspiracy against him and he wasn't going to tolerate it. He introduced a law that made radio and television subject to quote-unquote social responsibility, allegedly to protect children from inappropriate programs. This allowed Chavez to impose heavy fines and take away broadcasting licenses if the media did something he didn't like. Companies began self-censoring. Journalists that criticized the government would lose their jobs and even get arrested. Another important institution was the Electoral Authority, named CNE. This controlled everything related to elections, how they happened, what the rules were, what counted as a violation of the rules. It also, crucially, controlled vote counting. Since taking power, Chavez had been packing the Electoral Authority with loyalists. The opposition were outraged by this, believing that Chavez had an unfair advantage. They argued that election results weren't valid and decided to boycott the congressional elections of 2005. Of course, this meant that Congress was now entirely composed of Chavez supporters. In 2006, Chavez himself was up for re-election. Polls said that 55% of people would support him, so it looked like an easy win. His control of the Electoral Authority meant that he was able to break election rules. For instance, he used government money for his own campaign. In the end, the election was a blowout. Chavez won 63% of the vote, crushing his opponent. With a big new mandate from the Venezuelan people, Chavez became more and more left-wing. He claimed that capitalism was the source of all evil. Poverty, inequality and corruption were all due to neoliberalism.
We've been cursed by the influence of capitalism, by the thirst for unbridled consumerism.
Chavez increased the expropriations, with all sorts of different companies getting expropriated. Telecoms companies, electricity companies, a dairy producer, cement producers, steel producers. Those are just some of the different types of businesses that were confiscated by the government. He also took full control of the central bank, meaning that he got to control the printing of money. Inflation had long been a problem in Venezuela, not at hyperinflation levels, but generally around 20%. The response from Chavez was to impose price controls on food, which led to shortages and empty supermarket shelves. Sometimes only one supermarket would have a particular product, so people would have to queue for hours to get into that supermarket. The food could, of course, be bought from street traders if you were willing to pay a higher price. Chavez dubbed this the curse of capitalism and declared war on so-called hoarders and speculators. 6-year prison sentences were issued for anyone breaking the price regulations. The government set prices were so low that many food businesses were forced to sell at a loss, and many of them went bankrupt. If they sold above the government set prices, they faced fines or having their business expropriated. Chavez even threatened to take over the entire food industry if it didn't do what he said. The crackdown on the media continued apace. Radio Caracas Television, a channel that had been on air for 53 years, was closed down. It broadcast for the last time in May of 2007. This received condemnation from the USA and the EU. The president of Costa Rica even called it a mortal blow to democracy. Now there was only one TV channel opposed to Chavez. As independent media got shut down, government-run media increased significantly. When Chavez took over, the government owned only one TV station. By 2007, it had 6, all of them pouring out pro-Chavez propaganda. Crime was also getting significantly worse. Caracas became South America's most violent capital. In the years since Chavez took over, the murder rate had tripled, and by 2007, it was the second highest in the world. This was largely due to a very low conviction rate, with only 3% of murderers getting convicted. Now into his second term, Chavez faced the same problem he had before: term limits in the constitution. He again pushed to change the constitution, this time to allow him to run for president indefinitely. This is only 8 years after he changed the constitution the first time. The constitution that he proposed was much more left-wing than the previous one. It described elections as for the construction of socialism. It said that the role of the central bank was to contribute to the socialist economy. The new constitution would also make expropriation of businesses much easier. The government wouldn't even need a court ruling to confiscate farms and food factories. The constitutional change was put to a referendum, and it looked certain that it would pass. Chavez had won every single election or referendum since he came to power. However, for the first and only time in his political career, Chavez lost. He recognized the defeat and said that he'd been progressing too fast for the Venezuelan people. However, he wasn't going to give up that easily. He simply decided to redo the referendum. He'd have to do this soon though. Up until now, Chavez had been keeping the show on the road due to a huge increase in the oil price. In the 8 years since he took power, the oil price had increased 8-fold. However, with the 2008 recession, the oil price fell by 2/3. This price drop was a huge threat to the economy and to Chavez's popularity. His enormous government spending was totally dependent on the oil money. The good times might soon be coming to an end, so if Chavez was going to redo the referendum, he had to do it as soon as possible. It happened in early 2009. Chavez was even more willing to corrupt the referendum process. State television and radio spent all their time promoting the change in the constitution. Public buildings were plastered with pro-Chavez propaganda. Even the Caracas Metro played pro-Chavez songs. Any demonstrations against the new constitution were dispersed with tear gas. In the end, Chavez won second time round. He could now run for president as many times as he wanted. Gradually, Chavez became more and more repressive. He began to intimidate opposition, who had to go into hiding. A former defense minister for Chavez was arrested and accused of corruption. He had been in the cabinet for Chavez, but had switched sides to join the opposition, and that got him arrested. Chavez even started to ban the opposition from elections. More journalists were arrested, more radio stations were taken off air. They even made a law that would jail any person for allegedly damaging mental health. Over time, Chavez's economic policies began to take their toll. The nationalized electricity and water companies became less productive, leading to blackouts and water shortages. Chavez increased the expropriations of companies and farms. A lot of the companies were seized because they were accused of selling above the government set prices. Often, these companies were unable to operate at the government set prices and went bust. The expropriation of farms was destroying Venezuela's food industry. According to the government's own figures, it confiscated 3 million hectares of farmland in 2010 alone. The farms would very quickly become unproductive, and as you would imagine, food production collapsed. That meant that Venezuela had to rely more on imports, and by 2010, 70% of Venezuela's food was imported. Even the imports had problems though. In one incident, thousands of containers of imported food ended up rotting in the ports. This was because the government had bungled the distribution of it. It eventually admitted that 30,000 tons of food had rotted in the ports. There was now significant discontent with Chavez, which was clear to see in the parliamentary election of 2010. For the first time, more people voted against Chavez than for him. His party still won the majority of the seats because of gerrymandering, but it sent a message about the level of discontent in the country. Remember, the opposition had boycotted the parliamentary elections of 2005, so for the past 5 years there had not been a single opposition member of Congress. While Chavez had more seats, he didn't have a 2/3 majority, which meant that he would have to negotiate for certain things like Supreme Court justices. However, the new Congress wouldn't actually come into power for another 3 months. Chavez used this time to pass all sorts of authoritarian measures. A law was passed that enabled him to rule by decree for 18 months. He also rushed through 9 new judges to the Supreme Court. Some of the new opposition members of Congress were put on trial for bogus crimes. The nationalizations continued apace. Again, all sorts of companies were confiscated. Steel companies, bottle makers, housing construction companies. Chavez would give dubious reasons for the expropriations. He would say, for instance, that he was breaking up monopolies or enforcing labor rules. An example was an American glassmaker named Owens, Illinois. Chavez said that the company was exploiting its workers and destroying forests, so he expropriated it.
Ya está lista la expropiación de la empresa esta de vidrio, ¿cómo se llama? Owens, Illinois. Exprópiese. Una empresa de capitales norteamericanos que tiene aquí años explotando a los trabajadores, destrozando el ambiente allá en Trujillo. Vayan a ver los cerros que han destrozado.
At times, the expropriations were gratuitous. Sometimes Chavez would just go on a power trip and expropriate stuff just for fun.
¿Este edificio aquí cuál es?
También es un edificio que tiene locales comerciales de propiedad privada, por tanto...
Expropiese, señor alcalde. Expropiese. Expropiese. ¿Y este edificio?
Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería.
Expropiese. Expropiese.
De acuerdo.
¿Y aquel edificio allá en la esquina?
In total, Chavez expropriated 2,000 businesses. Often, workers at these firms would find out that their company was going to be expropriated by seeing Chavez announce it on television.
Bueno, Agroisleña está expropiada.
Of all the things that Chavez did, the expropriations were one of the most damaging to Venezuela's economy. Often, the companies would simply collapse, and expropriating them was equivalent to shutting them down. In theory, the company would continue running just under government management. In reality, previously productive companies would become corrupt and inefficient when under government control. A good example was a steel company called Seador. Before nationalization, it produced 4 million tons of steel per year. Immediately after nationalization, it produced 2 million tons. That was one of the better outcomes. Many of the companies would simply cease operating. Expropriated farmland would also become unproductive under government management. Often, it was simply abandoned after it had been confiscated. The price controls were also hugely damaging. Companies would end up making a loss because they had to charge less than the cost of production. When they couldn't sustain those losses, they went bankrupt. Together, the expropriation and the price controls destroyed thousands of productive companies. The loss of these companies meant that the economy as a whole produced less, and then people got poorer. This, more than anything else, is the source of Venezuela's economic ruin. By 2011, Chavez was clearly unwell and had to go to Cuba for surgery. Eventually, he admitted that he had cancer.
Confirmaron la existencia de un tumor abscesado.
There was immediately a lot of uncertainty about the future of Venezuela. The regime was hugely centered around Chavez himself. How would it function if he died? This also made the 2012 election seem a lot more within reach for the opposition. It would be an uphill battle though. Chavez had a charisma that nobody else could match. His campaign featured the usual pledges. He vowed to make socialism irreversible in Venezuela and save the planet from capitalism. He used authoritarian measures too, closing the last remaining hostile TV channel, Globovision. In the end though, these measures weren't necessary. Chavez won the election 54-44, another huge victory. It's important to emphasize that Chavez had now been in power for 14 years. Even after all that time, he was still winning elections. The elections weren't totally free and fair, but even if they had been, he probably still would have won. Chavez was to live only 5 months after the election. He died on the 5th of March 2013.
Ha fallecido el comandante presidente Hugo Chávez Frías.
Huge numbers turned out for his state funeral. To many, he was a hero that had taken on the corrupt ruling class and cared about the poor for the first time. Chavez had spent a lot of money on the poor, but nowhere near as much as he could have spent. He had been unbelievably lucky with the price of oil, which had tripled since he became president. In his 14 years in power, Venezuela had earned almost $1 trillion in oil revenue. That's $30,000 for each man, woman and child in Venezuela, enough to give each person more than $2,000 per year. Venezuela had earned almost 3 times as much oil revenue as it had in the 14 years before Chavez took over. He had essentially wasted the majority of the money, and a fraction of it had made it to the poor. A huge amount of that money was simply stolen. That's how people such as Hugo Chávez's daughter, Maria Chavez, are now worth at least $4 billion, probably much more. That's from the daughter of the man who said that to be rich was evil and inhuman.
No queremos ser rico es malo, es inhumano, así lo digo, y condenen a los ricos cada vez que les dé la gana.
With the death of Chavez, there had to be an election for his replacement. Chavez had named Nicolas Maduro as his successor, who was seen as a likable figure but not so charismatic. Maduro made the endorsement from Chavez the centerpiece of his campaign. "A vote for Maduro is a vote for Chavez" was his slogan. Maduro pretty much deified Chavez. He called him the Christ of America, who gave his life for each one of us. The Catholic Church was not amused by that, and they said that Chavez should not be compared with Christ. Like his mentor, Maduro broke election rules using state funds for his campaign. He also did everything he could to demonize his opponent, calling him a murderous fascist. The result of the election was unbelievably close, with Maduro winning by less than 2 percentage points. Like previously, the election was far from clean. However, in the past, that probably didn't matter that much because Chavez had won by such wide margins. In this election though, it's very likely that if it had been clean, Maduro would have lost. The opposition didn't accept the result. Protests broke out in the streets, which the government repressed. There was a lot of violence, much of it carried out by pro-government gangs known as colectivos. The regime gave these gangs a free pass to attack and intimidate anyone who opposed the government. The prisons minister even called them a fundamental pillar in defense of the homeland. Thousands of demonstrators were arrested and 40 people died. Venezuela hadn't seen protests like these since 2002. The economy continued to worsen and Maduro doubled down on the far-left policies. He jailed shopkeepers who rose prices. Basic goods such as milk, rice or toilet paper were now rarely on supermarket shelves. The combination of economic crisis and political unrest led to chaos, with looting breaking out in many areas. When the National Guard were deployed to stop the looting, they simply joined in. Food shortages were worse than ever, which the government tried to cover up. Taking photos of the empty supermarket shelves was banned, and journalists reporting on the food shortages were arrested. It got so bad that people were forced to queue overnight for food. Eventually that was banned too, because it was more embarrassing for the government to have overnight queues than daytime queues. While Venezuela under Chavez had been authoritarian, due to his ability to win elections, he'd never needed to become fully totalitarian. Under Maduro, Venezuela became totalitarian. He issued a decree allowing the armed forces to use their weapons against protesters. A spy network was set up in the military to sniff out any sign of a coup. A former mayor of Caracas was arrested when he was still in his pajamas. This was a level of repression that Venezuela had not seen before. It was all necessary because Maduro was so unpopular. He now had an approval about 20%. The majority of people hated him. For instance, he visited the island of Margarita thinking he would be greeted with affection. Actually, locals reacted by banging pots and pans at him, and Maduro had to run away. The whole incident was shared on social media by a journalist who was then arrested for bogus crimes. All this discontent was made clear in the parliamentary election of 2015. The opposition was made up of all sorts of different groups, from Marxists to free market capitalists. However, they were united in one thing: their determination to bring down Maduro. With 70% of voters saying that they would vote against the government, it looked like the Chavez revolution might finally lose an election. When the results came in, they were damning for the government. The opposition won 109 seats, while Maduro won 55. This was a big deal. With this many seats, the opposition might actually have enough power to change things. They had won a 2/3 majority, which in theory meant that they could dismiss Supreme Court judges and members of the electoral authority. Perhaps they would even be able to make these institutions impartial again. They might even be able to force Maduro out in a referendum. However, there was a huge amount against them. While the opposition now controlled Congress, Maduro and his supporters controlled everything else. Maduro pulled the same trick that Chavez had. The parliamentary election was in December of 2015, but the new Congress wouldn't take power until the following month. Maduro used this time to pack the Supreme Court, adding 13 new members. That Supreme Court then ruled that 3 of the new opposition congressmen couldn't be sworn in due to allegations of electoral fraud. The loss of these 3 congressmen was crucial because it meant that the opposition lost their 2/3 supermajority. Without that supermajority, they wouldn't be able to remove people from the Supreme Court or the electoral authority. The opposition tried everything to oust Maduro. They proposed a constitutional amendment to shorten presidential terms, but it was blocked by the Supreme Court. They then tried to call a referendum on whether Maduro should step down. The electoral authority did everything it could to block this. 20% of the population needed to register their desire for the referendum. The electoral authority allowed only 3 days for the signatures to be collected at polling stations that were only open for 6 hours per day. It also limited the number of voting machines available. For that 20% figure to be met, voters would have only 90 seconds to cast their vote, given the time constraints. Despite that, the figure was met, so it looked like the referendum would take place. However, various courts then declared that one of the early stages of the process had been fraudulent. This was of course nonsense, but it served its purpose. The referendum was not going to happen. By 2017, after almost 20 years of disastrous economic policies, the economy began to collapse. Production was half what it had been, and inflation reached 1,000,000%. Money was so worthless that people used it to make novelty items like bags or ornaments, which they would then sell. Even high oil prices couldn't help now, as almost all of the oil money was getting stolen. Employees at the state-owned oil company even started stealing machinery. For ordinary Venezuelans, life was absolute hell. 90% of people didn't have enough to eat, and 20% of children were suffering malnutrition. People joked that they were on the Maduro diet. Basic items like bread or toilet paper were often impossible to find, leaving people desperate. When basic goods were available in a supermarket, there would be a stampede to try to get there before the shelves were empty. People would even have physical fights over the most basic of items. Venezuela also began to suffer frequent power cuts. To save power, the government told shopping centres to close early, and civil servants were to work just 2 days a week. Sometimes parts of the country would be without power for days. There was a similar situation with the water supply. In 2018, Caracas, the capital, didn't have running water for an entire month. With the economy in freefall, the migration out of Venezuela increased dramatically. For those who wanted to leave, getting a passport was almost impossible because the government had run out of plastic for the new passports. When the refugees arrived, they were often given significant help from the host nations. Sometimes though, there were clashes with the locals and the refugees' belongings would get set on fire. By 2017, the only thorn in Maduro's side was the Congress that was still controlled by the opposition. To subjugate it, Maduro pulled the same trick that Chavez had when he first came to power. He created a constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution. The assembly would then be given supreme power in Venezuela.
Hoy Nicolás Maduro busca imponer una asamblea constituyente que eliminaría el Parlamento y las elecciones libres. En otras palabras, busca tener una especie de poder absoluto y sin contrapesos.
The Constituent Assembly was elected in July of 2017 in the most blatant election rigging that Venezuela had seen. This was the first time that virtually all the votes were falsified, a truly artificial election. The whole of Latin America hadn't seen an election this bad for decades. As you would expect, the government won all the seats and other countries refused to recognize the assembly. In 2018, Maduro himself was up for re-election. With all the opposition leaders in jail or in exile, rigging the election was barely even necessary. Maduro scheduled the election for 8 months before the end of his term, so even if something did go wrong, he would have plenty of time to sort it out. The phony election happened and Maduro was sworn in again in 2019. Almost all nations declared that the election and Maduro were illegitimate. It's now that we see the ascension of Juan Guaido. Guaido was the head of the Congress, which, don't forget, is still held by the opposition. He argued that he should be recognized as the president of Venezuela. The constitution said that if there was no president, the head of Congress would become president by default. Guaido argued that since Maduro was illegitimate, there wasn't a president and therefore he should be recognized as president. Guaido declared himself acting president on January 23rd as tens of thousands watched. The USA, Europe and the majority of Latin America all recognized him as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Whether Maduro could cling to power ultimately came down to the military. The opposition appealed to them directly to help oust Maduro. However, from the very beginning, Chavez had made sure that the military profited handsomely from the socialist revolution. Maduro had continued this, with many high-ranking officers getting senior positions in the government. He put the army in charge of food distribution. This was supposedly to help with the food crisis, but really it was a way to get the army on side. The distribution system was easy to abuse, meaning that the army could make money from bribes. Allowing the army to profit from the corruption gave it a stake in Maduro's dictatorship. Eventually, the army was given the oil industry to plunder. The military was also kept in line through intimidation. Any men who criticized the government would be arrested and imprisoned. Maduro even had a network of Cuban spies to sniff out any dissent. Torturing of prisoners was routine.
Siendo golpeado con palos, con un bate, con manopla de metal, con cadenas. Mi esposo está todo lleno de morados. Es una posición que lo colocan así y perdió la sensibilidad de las manos. No puede mover las manos como normalmente se hace.
Like many dictators before him, Maduro was using fear as a tool to remain in power. However, despite these measures, there was unrest in the military. While people at the top were doing very well, the low-ranking officers were affected by the economic crisis just like other Venezuelans. Soldiers were regularly trying to start rebellions.
Nos declaramos en legítima rebeldía, unidos hoy más que nunca con el bravo pueblo de Venezuela para desconocer la tiranía asesina de Nicolás Maduro.
There was even an assassination attempt on Maduro. In August of 2018, 2 drones with explosives were flown towards him. All the National Guard conscripts immediately ran away, something that was seen on television. The assassination attempt was likely done by members of the National Guard. With the army still under Maduro's control, Guaido worked with the USA to try to get it to defect. They made a plan that they hoped would shame Maduro and persuade the army to switch sides. It was, to a large degree, a publicity stunt. The USA would send a large amount of humanitarian aid to Cucuta in Colombia. From there, Guaido would supervise the transfer of the aid into Venezuela. The idea was that the Venezuelans were so clearly desperate for the food and medicine that if Maduro turned it away, he would look even worse than he already did. Hopefully, this would play on the consciences of the Venezuelan military. Surely they couldn't support a regime that was blocking food from getting to its starving citizens. Hopefully that would be enough to make them defect. It felt like now or never. much of the democratic world was working together to try to remove Maduro. Warehouses in Cucuta were packed with biscuits, toilet paper, medicine, all sorts of things ready to be moved into Venezuela. The plan was to have an army of volunteers carry the aid into Venezuela. More than 200,000 people volunteered to help. It quickly became clear that Maduro was going to block the aid from entering Venezuela. He denied that there was a humanitarian crisis in the country and said that the aid was the beginning of an American invasion. He put shipping containers and a water tank on some of the bridges to keep the supplies out. Still, the plan went ahead. The big day was going to be February 23rd, 2018. The presidents of Colombia, Chile, Paraguay were in Cucuta to monitor the events. Lorries filled with aid drove towards the Venezuelan border, where they were repelled with tear gas. Little aid got through. All eyes were on the military. Would they defect? The High Command showed no signs of budging. Having profited from being in charge of oil and mining, they were invested in the Maduro dictatorship. Guaido aimed his appeal at low-ranking officers whose lives were as miserable as anyone else's. 60 members of the Venezuelan armed forces did defect. Their families went on to be tortured or raped. In the end, it all came to nothing, and Maduro declared victory. He celebrated by dancing salsa with his wife in Caracas. That day in Cucuta was the biggest attempt to topple Maduro, and it failed. The opposition did keep trying, but they got nowhere. Gradually, the world's attention moved elsewhere, and countries were forced to accept that Maduro would remain in power. At the time of making this video, Nicolas Maduro continues to hold Venezuela hostage. Negotiations with the opposition have been going on for years, but few people expect anything to come from them. Since Chavez came to power, 6 million Venezuelans have fled. Almost all those that remain live in poverty. However, one day Maduro will fall. Hopefully then, Venezuela will be able to regain its democracy and rebuild its once prosperous nation.